Somebody asked me a question real quick. Are you suggesting there are some good deals on buying office towers now? You know, it's funny because we did a webinar on leasing, and certainly those leasing companies weren't seeing a whole lot of movement. I'm not sure we're going to touch on that today with BDO, but so far, at least in San Diego, the commercial market didn't see a whole lot of movement. That may change. It's a very fluid situation. So let's go ahead and get started. So my name's Kevin Carroll. I'm Executive Director of Tech San Diego. Welcome to another one of our webinars on the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been really trying to get our members and those in the technology community as much information as we can. This one's going to be really interesting because in the past, what we've looked at is kind of some of these very immediate issues on, you know, impact of the CARES Act, renegotiating your lease, things like that. This one is one I've been waiting for, and it's really going to take a look at what are the impacts of COVID-19, whether that's supply chain or the workplace or whatever that is. We're going to spend some time. We're going to take a look at it. We have assembled a really, geez, these folks are from all over the country with BDO, and they're going to walk us through this. So I'm not going to read bios for these gentlemen. They'll give a brief introduction of who they are. And in order to get right to the program, we're not going to read off these pages of their bios. Suffice it to say, these are global thought leaders in their respective areas. So everyone from manufacturing, supply chain, R&D tax, you can see the who's with us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aftab Jamil, and he'll be able to get us started today. I will go on mute, and we'll be looking at the questions that come in. So Aftab, it's all up to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's discussion, and thank you for your kind words, Kevin. If we move to the next slide, please, Brian, in terms of the agenda. As Kevin mentioned, that we are going to cover different elements of what we are seeing, the impact of technology industry, and be it some of the issues on the supply chain or steps that companies should be thinking of weathering this economic crisis, as well as some updates, some nuances of the CARES Act. So hopefully we'll get into a good dialogue and have the opportunity to answer any questions you may have as well. Moving to the next slide. A quick introduction of myself. I'm a partner at BDO. Been in public accounting for about 30 years. I'm based in Silicon Valley, and I pretty much in the last 25 plus years, I have only worked with the clients either on technology or biotech. Being based in Silicon Valley, that is what I focus on. I also have the distinct honor of leading BDO's national and global technology industry group. So, my views obviously been formed based on my direct experience, as well as what I'm hearing from our clients and our colleagues throughout the US. Let's move to the next slide, please, Brian. So I am going to start by giving you a quick overview of what was the view of the industry just before we entered into this crisis. These the data points that you see, and I'll speak to those in a moment. This was the data points that we just obtained by doing our annual technology CFO Outlook survey. This was the 13th consecutive year in which we did do the survey. That survey covers 100 technology CFOs. These were public and private companies. Typically ranging from a revenue standpoint from $100 million to about $3 billion, covering both the B2B and B2C, public and private. So a pretty good broad data point of how the technology industry CFOs, when they put on the lens of how the 2020 was going to look like, that is what we found out. And as you can see that 84% of the CFOs, at that time were saying that their business was expected to thrive. By the way, from a timing standpoint, we did this survey from mid-November to end of December, and we published our report in the third week of January. So this was the point where in some of the locations like China, the COVID crisis had hit, but in the US, we were still, pre-COVID stage. And as you can see that 9 out of 10 CFOs were expecting the top line growth as well as the profitability growth. That is notwithstanding the fact that the same CFOs were expecting about 70%, I would say, that were expecting that we will enter into recession within the next 1 to 2 years. Notwithstanding their fears for or concerns about recession, they still felt that their businesses were expected to do well. So that was, essentially to show the resilience of what the tech CFOs thought the industry was about. A lot of reasons, obviously, for that kind of sentiment. You'll recall that that was, the lowest unemployment rate, very high consumer confidence. A lot of investments were going on at that time, and I'm going to share some data points with you. And with all that, that is what was contributing to the very bullish prospects for the industry's growth. So that is the starting point. Just before we entered the COVID, one of the big factor obviously was, keeping in mind all that was going on, there was an expectation that there will be very robust IT spending as well, which, as you can imagine, for technology companies, that is what will drive in turn the growth that the CFOs were expecting. COVID-19 entered the stage, and Brian, if we move to the next slide, and to the next one, please. So the IT spending that we talked about, you can actually track on the timeline. And what this graph is showing is the IT spending growth forecast. This is not BDO data. This is, courtesy of some publicly available information that I thought, covers the point really well. That on the left-hand side, we're starting at the end of January. The analysts' expectations were from an IT spending standpoint. And as we move forward on the timing spectrum, you can see that the confidence level is going down, down, down. By end of March is finally where, it got into the negative category. So with the passage of time, as the pandemic got worse and worse, obviously, as you can see, the confidence going down. Next slide, please, Brian. Not all these subsectors within technology being a very, vast industry group or industry, I should say. Obviously, within that, there are subsectors. Some, were not as heavily impacted as others. And, I'm not going to get into too much of the details, but this was just to show you that declining trend in the sentiment, but not everyone, all subsectors dipping into the negatives. So, software, for example, while the expectations have gone down, it has still stayed positive, but other areas have gone down quite a bit. Let's move to the next slide, please. So, with all that being said, what is at the macro level, what is the state of affairs? I think the biggest issue, obviously, as you can imagine, is the uncertainty that creeps into the environment with the COVID situation. Not knowing, when is the end, how we're gonna open, when we're gonna open, which part of the economy are going to open, is causing, a pause, if you will, that comes in with that uncertainty. In the technology sector, the deal making, be it the M&A or private equities investment into technology or VC's investments, M&A activity, all that uncertainty is having an impact on that, causing issues for all types of stakeholders, suppliers, customer, employees, investors. That challenges obviously been having on the technology companies and businesses valuations as well. And we've seen some pretty high profile companies taking quite a bit of hit on the valuation standpoint, even in the private markets. So those unicorns, they have seen a fair amount of decline in their individual valuations. So it has implications for everyone who is involved in that. So let's move to the next slide, please, Brad. So when I sit back and try to look at and saying, okay, what are some of the short-term, medium-term, and long-term considerations for the technology industry? Both based on the clients that I serve as well as observations of the market, we went through pretty dramatic, falls and surges in demands, supply shock and demand shock. In fact, some technology companies that I'm aware of, they had actually one of the best quarters, the March quarter, that is. And the problem obviously is that, just at the consumer level, we have seen some panic buying. I think that is also true at the corporate as well. So while some of those companies had a very robust quarters, it was very difficult for them to delineate the impact of that so-called panic buying on pulling up the demand versus ongoing demand. So the industry is still trying to sort that out, that how to absorb those demand and supply shocks. There are companies and subsectors where there is a demand, but there are issues in terms of providing the product and the supply and managing that, both with respect to the ongoing balancing the ongoing business as well as the safety. Human capital management, a really difficult balance to achieve that. Talent was hard to get by and locate and hold on to. So now the dynamics are, how much of that you protect versus managing your cash. And we have seen some companies in the Silicon Valley area, some very big and well-known companies having significant layoffs as well, in addition to the furloughs and other techniques. From a medium-term consideration standpoint, obvious point, perhaps that acceleration of remote learning, acceleration of digital transformation. For example, Microsoft CEO recently mentioned that he has seen 2 years worth of digital transformation taking place within 2 months. And what the technology sector has shown that with the products and technology, not only the sector itself, but it is an enabler for many other industries to be able to deal with the challenge. No one is able to suggest that we know what the new normal is. That is still being written. The technology industry, among others, is heavily impacted by the consumer confidence, and we all have seen that how that has been shaken. Valuations I talked about, be it IPOs, obviously, really other than the expectation was in 2020, there were some pretty high-profile companies that were expected to complete their IPO, but obviously all of that is on the hold. M&A. Interestingly, what our observation is that the deals that had commenced before the pre-COVID situation and the diligence had been completed, many of those deals are still proceeding, but there is a pause in terms of the new investments. One other point that I will make is that China and some of the Asian markets went into this COVID crisis before us, and they are or have come out of the shutdown of the economy sooner than us as well. And I think that is, while I'm not suggesting that exactly what happens in China will happen in the US as well, nevertheless, what we are observing can be very instructive for us. I have seen and talked to the companies where they're actually seeing demand returning, not to the pre-COVID level, but nevertheless, a good recovery at least taking place in China and some other Asian locations, which certainly is it's heartening to see, because then that means, if that happens to us as well, and China being a very big market for the US tech companies as well, I think that bodes well for us. On the longer term basis, supply chain, that obviously will need to be redesigned, reimagined. I'm not going to take time on that topic, given that one of my colleagues, Jeff, is going to drill into that. Tech companies, they will have to, reimagine the just-in-time arrangement so that, and the working capital considerations along with that. I think the one difference, I'm not an economist, but what from my perspective, the difference between the great recessions of 2008, 9, 10, and the COVID recession that we're going through now is that at that time, there was a huge credit crunch, illiquidity. So even those companies who wanted to do something, they just simply didn't have the credit to go along with that. We are not seeing that. There is availability of capital, and I'm just going to show you some data points real quick. And Brian, if we can move to the next slide, please. This, for example, is the Q1 activity, and this is VC funding only, does not even include the private equity. And you can see some robust numbers. Artificial intelligence, $4.5 billion going into 148 companies. And you can read the slides, the fintech, the digital tech. Interestingly, the supply chain tech companies, 48 companies getting $1 billion funding. That's the first time that is appearing as high on this, on my radar at least, of sectors that are getting VC funding. So a lot of money has gone in as recently as the completed Q1. Next slide, please, Brian. In addition to this tech CFOs, we also survey private equity CFOs. And when we asked the question just a few short months ago as to what subsectors within technology PEs were expecting, from a growth perspective, that's the top four, I should say, or top five, with the 5G and artificial intelligence and Internet of Things, aligns very well with the VC funding that I just showed a minute ago. Next slide, please. I am not going to spend a lot of time on this, chart, which is difficult to read anyways. But the point that I was trying to make was this is the analysts who track the software and services sectors and their expectations. Not looking backwards. As an auditor, I'm a historian, so I do look out for the analysts and what their views are. So this group, this portfolio of the companies, it does not cover all, but it has software companies and services companies like Adobe and IBM and Microsoft and Salesforce and Shopify, those types of companies. You can see that the sentiment of the growth, revenue growth, is going down, it's declining. But interestingly, as recently as end of April, analysts are still expecting growth in this sector, not going into negative. Next slide, please. Same view, but this is for hardware. Hardware dipped into the negative expectations, but you can see that this sector is expected to snap right back. And the companies that are in this grouping are like the HP and Juniper and Apple and Cisco and CDW and Dell, those types of companies. Next slide, please. This is the semiconductor equipment company again. Companies like AMD, Intel, Applied Micro, Lam, Micron, Broadcom, Qualcomm, that's the grouping. And again, you can see that, changes and declines nevertheless, but not very drastic, which is a good thing. Next slide, please. There is a resilience in certain tech companies, and you can see while the overall market has been down, this is through end of April, Amazon and Netflix and Shopify and Teladoc. So Teladoc is a telemedicine company showing a great deal of resilience. So not all the subsectors are necessarily, having the huge negative impact. Next slide, please. And I'm running out of time, so I want to wrap that up quickly. Quick point, and I think that's probably where some of my optimism and hope comes. Last year was the highest ever, $532 billion of private equity and money that was raised. Not all of that is for tech, but we know that historically a lot of private equity investments have gone into tech. So they had their record year from a fundraising standpoint. And next slide, which I think is my last, which is the tech-focused private equity funds. They also had a record year in terms of fundraising. So altogether, there is an estimated $1 trillion of dry powder ready to be deployed, and a lot of that, hopefully should be available to tech sector as well. So overall, I would say, my view is that while we all are going to go through, pretty tough year, but from a medium to long term, tech sector should do well. And I'll stop there and, hand it off to my colleague, Eskander. Eskander, take it away, please.
Aftab, thank you very much. Good day, everybody. My name is Eskander Yavar. I'm BDO's National Manufacturing Practice Leader. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about not being chaotic in chaotic times. Early on, when this COVID-19 atomic bomb got dropped on our business and society, communities, it was interesting to watch the headlines and the behaviors. A lot of us didn't know how to react, what to do. And at BDO figured we had to have seen things like this before. And so what we did is develop a framework to really drive through the stages of what we are calling from resilience through recession agenda is going to look like. And it's really premised on a couple of items, but the 4 stages look as follows: persevere, maintain, recover, and thrive. And I'm going to talk through a couple key points in the persevere stage first, and then the model actually repeats itself. If you could flip, please. So here's the premise that we're working from, right? And not to put BDO out as health economists, which we are not, but our world and our human race has seen pandemics before, and they have certain behavioral characteristics to them. They have stages that they go through, and those stages have characteristics that we can at least understand from the past. At the same time, if you actually click, you can see that we're faced with 2 curves today, right? The health curve on top, and then the economic recessionary curve at the bottom. In the persevere stage, there's a little bit of language here that talks about how it's described, but clearly there's an immediacy to what's happening. Everybody's being reactive, and really it's about keeping employees' health and safety top of mind, and then understanding your supply chain and customer base and how that's connected to your business. And then as this model builds, as you click through the slide, you actually see how both the recession curves and the health curves can transform. So at the bottom right-hand side of this presentation, you'll see letters that are now familiar to everybody, right? A V-shaped recession, W, U, and L. It's important to note that many of the pandemics of the past did have multiple curves to them until adequate therapeutics and vaccinations were available to the masses. While we hoped early on for a V-shaped curve, more and more we're talking about U or W-shaped recessionary curves to follow the pandemic lines. And I think this is a bit complicated by the fact that there's lack of a consistent national strategy when addressing COVID-19. And so we're really seeing a lot of state and local governments taking matters into their own hands. So this even starts to complicate itself by a geography, subsector of industry perspective. But that's how this model works. We actually build through every stage, and then we actually have pain points, considerations, and solutions that companies should be thinking about as they're walking through each of these stages. Next. So if you think through the vertical axis, which is the 4 stages we just discussed: persevere, maintain, recover, and thrive, and you think through some of the key elements of business, our human capital, strategy and operations of the operation, risks, financials, regulations, what we put here is a placemat of topics that should be of interest depending on the stage that you're in. What we're hoping is that this framework, this point of view that BDO developed, can serve as a reference document when you're having strategic conversations. In manufacturing, as I'm sure it is in the technology sector, not many companies are trying to predict the next 12 to 18 months of cash flow forecasting. What they're really trying to do is look at the next quarter to 180 days. And as you're planning through those quarters, these are topics that we think are top of mind. So just as an example, employee health and safety from a people perspective in the persevere stage. And then crisis management and customer retention. From a pain points perspective, you can see that, thank you. From a risk perspective, it's supply chain continuity, liquidity and cash flow. We saw a lot of our clients actually draw down a lot of their credit lines to make sure they could weather the storm in the coming quarters. And then always keeping in mind towards our regulatory policy and developments that we need to be in compliance there. And then if you go to the maintain stage below, you can see topics that should be of interest for organizations as they're planning through that stage. And then it starts to build. What we hope to see is a quicker recovery. And then back to some of the slides that Aftab was talking about, more of a thriving economy. But nobody can predict the future. You see states reopening on a consistent basis now, and then you see contradicting reports that talk about increases in caseload from a COVID perspective. Our view is until there's a mass vaccination at hand, it's going to be a bit of a turbulent ride for the coming 6 to 12 months. Next. So just drilling down a little bit further into the persevere stage. By each of these categories, what we try to do here to be of assistance and help to our clients is to talk about what are the pain points that are top of mind during this stage. And I won't read all of these to you, but you can imagine from a people perspective, it's all about health and safety. I had the pleasure of sitting on a couple of town hall calls with about 150 manufacturing executives, and early on in March when those calls were happening, that was the top of mind question. Taking temperatures of employees in the facilities, making sure they're able to work remotely, and making sure the supply chain was in order. And that's what the CFOs and CEOs that are on these calls were really worried about. And then from a strategy and operations perspective, it's about constant communication in a time of crisis, making sure outwardly to your customers and suppliers and inwardly to your employees, there's frequent communication top of mind. I can tell you at our firm and within my team, I changed my all hands meetings from a monthly basis to a weekly basis just to make sure that our people had clarity and understood what was in front of us as we were all going through a crisis that many of us had never seen before. And then from a risk and financial perspective, it's about understanding supply chain continuity and managing cash to make sure that appropriate cost reduction steps are being made. You have access to the capital as we talked about, and you're appropriately leveraging your cost model based on the revenue model. Next. Along the lines of pain points, don't bring problems, but also bring solutions in the spirit of that. This slide's about considerations. If those are the pain points, here are things that we should be considering. So we hope this is helpful. From a people perspective, we ran through a couple items like providing workers with PPE. And I'll have a neat story about that shortly, or ensuring that workspaces are adequately spaced apart. I myself haven't been into a grocery store now in the last 3 months. I just do the curbside pickup. From a supply chain continuity perspective, identifying alternative suppliers and transportation modes. This is a really interesting topic, and Jeff Pratt, our national supply chain leader, may touch on it in a little bit. You may have seen some of the headlines in the news recently, but reshoring and repatriation of supply chain is something that's really top of mind for, Washington, D.C., and a lot of legislation that's going to be coming out on that just to incentivize U.S. businesses and manufacturers to actually consider alternatives to China. And then there's some key points for consideration around financials and regulation as well. I won't read through them in detail. This is going to be made available to you and really meant to serve as an aid as you think through how to navigate the coming months and quarters. Next. All right, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but at BDO, we really want to drive the do good that's happening out there with our manufacturers. And in this case, a company called Milliken understood that there was a lack of PPE, as we all did with the headlines that were coming out in March and April on a consistent basis, and decided to really pivot their operations in their manufacturing facility to drive PPE production. And we thought that looks great. And you've heard some of these stories yourselves in the news. We like to highlight them. We think manufacturers shifting to aid the country in the time of need and crisis is critical. And it's nice to see everybody coming together. If you flip to the next slide, there's a similar story with a company called Copperbottom Distillery, who was in the business of making primary spirits for consumption, and knowing that there was a hand sanitizer shortage, quickly shifted their operations to be able to provide hand sanitizers for those that are in need. So just a couple stories that I thought you guys might appreciate when you think through American manufacturers trying to help our country in a time of crisis. We really like to highlight those stories and ensure the word gets out. Next. All right, Jeff.
Thanks, Eskander. I'm Jeff Pratt. I work closely with the Eskander and team and lead our supply chain practice. Next slide, please. When we think about the impact of the pandemic and then I'll bring in some of the prior discussions and negotiations that were happening, in terms of global trade, because they're somewhat related. Just to set the context in terms of how we look at supply chain, really what we're trying to help organizations do are balance customer service and then the operational cost within the supply chain of providing that service, and then the capital investment. Things like inventories that get invested in and warehouse capacity, those types of things. And I mention that because just prior to the pandemic, we had released the results of our cross-industry BDO CFO survey, and we asked some questions around CFOs around the focus of supply chain, and there was a heavy focus on cost reduction at that point. Below that, there was balancing of customer service levels, and sort of far down the list, and maybe 4 or 5 on the list was risk management. So 34% of CFOs would say that, you know, managing costs was really the key thing, and maybe 13% were focused on risk management. And we've seen a definite shift in that, just based on the uncertainty that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, but also as a result of some of the trade negotiations and tax and tariff policies. Next slide, please. So what are we hearing from our clients? If you think about the breadth of supply chain, you know, the way we talk with our clients and think about supply chain is very much end to end. So what's happening with customer demand, and how do we have to react to that from a supply chain perspective, all the way through either manufacturing or distributing a product, and then provide customer support after the fact. So most of our clients, you know, initially when we talked with them at the beginning of the pandemic, they were really focused on some very you know, immediate things. So you know, as Eskander mentioned, making sure that there was a healthy, you know, there were health and safety provisions in place for the workforce, separating out who really had to be on site from a supply chain perspective. You know, who had to work in the warehouse, who had to drive a truck, who had to be on site in a manufacturing facility, versus everyone else who could support the effort from home. And from a technology perspective, that generated some immediate investment in some technologies and enablers, just to make sure that you know, people could be separated as much as possible. Most of our clients have experienced some real shifts in demand, and it's not always bad. Often there's an uptick in demand, but it's definitely a shift from what the plan was. So what that meant was that there were a lot of discussions with suppliers. There were long-term inventory investments that were planned that really got changed. There was very much a focus on supply chain agility. So how can I react to significant shifts from a customer base and have my supply chain be responsive enough and not be locked in so much to long-term decisions that I can really respond appropriately, not have too much money invested in working capital, and still serve customers as appropriate. Next slide, please. So going back to the resilience framework that Eskander introduced, you know, essentially, initially we were seeing, as I mentioned, supply chains really trying to immediately communicate with suppliers to try to get as good a sense as they could around the customer demand shifts, and turn off as much investment as they could in areas where they thought the demand was really going to diminish. And then of course, simplification. Most of our clients were coming off of a really strong economic environment, and they were seeing upticks, and they were to some extent probably not being as focused as they could have been in terms of product and service offerings. And this crisis really brought into focus the products and services that were most critical, you know, most creative in terms of profitability. And we are seeing organizations really think that through. And in many cases, I think what we're going to see is a step change in terms of how our clients are focused and what services and products they're providing. And then as they start to recover, and this is where most of the manufacturers and distributors that we work with, most of them are between maintain and recover at this point, and they're thinking about the longer term view of supply chain. And what that's likely to mean is investing in technologies to really have good agility and good visibility across the global supply chain. You know, robots and cobots to separate people to the extent possible, so that operations can continue without putting people at risk. And then, as Eskander mentioned, the overall footprint of the supply chain, and how to make that supply chain very highly enabled and agile going forward, with investments in things like Industry 4.0 technologies and processes. Next slide. I mentioned the tax and tariff negotiations earlier in the discussion, And what we believe is happening as a result of the pandemic, but also some of the uncertainty that got generated by many of the tariff negotiations, as you can see here, and this is from a third party source, the General Administration of Customs from China and Thomson Reuters. If you look at the Chinese exports to various parts of the world, North America was on the decline in terms of purchases from China prior to the pandemic, and you can see the downturn as a result of the pandemic. Next slide. And then if you take this one step further and look at some specific examples for industry subsectors, what you'll see is that different subsectors are affected differently, with some sectors like telephone equipment and household appliances and computer equipment, having seen a significant decline in terms of imports from China. Next slide. So as a result of a number of factors, our clients are really thinking through what the future supply chain footprint should look like. And the way that we're counseling them to look at this is to really think about the overall operational cost of supply chain, the optimization of the supply chain network itself, of course, in terms of transportation costs and inventory investments, when there's a far-flung supply chain, all the inventory that gets invested in that sits in cargo containers and so forth. But there are a number of other really important considerations that clients need to think through, and in many cases are thinking through. So things like site selection and the opportunity to take advantage of incentives from state and local governments, and we are seeing some really interesting opportunities in that space. And in fact, we have an aerospace and defense client that had selected a site in the U.S. and had gotten hundreds of millions of dollars in various incentives that we helped identify and pull together. Some of the other considerations in thinking about that future supply chain footprint are things like the tax and transfer pricing issues, and where operational elements of supply chain get positioned to really optimize the tax and transfer pricing opportunities within a global supply chain. The other thing that's sometimes overlooked and really is critical is the capability, not only the cost, but the capability and the availability of workforce. And we've talked with a number of manufacturers who have relocated into various parts of the U.S. and then ended up struggling a bit because they didn't have the skills and the availability of the dependable workforce, particularly with some of the technical skills that were required for a manufacturing location. So our thinking is that as organizations begin to think through the new supply chain footprint, we really think that they should take all these elements into consideration and make sure that there's nothing overlooked that would end up being a surprise or a detriment later. So with that, I'll turn the discussion over to David Wong, who will cover the CARES Act and provide an update.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So today, I will be covering some updates related to the CARES Act, along with one of my co-presenters, David Duski. My name is David Wong. Thank you all for joining us today. I am a partner with BDO's Business Incentives Group. My focus has primarily been with the research and development tax credit and other credits and incentives relating to companies that are either developing new products or processes or software, as well as any manufacturing companies focused on process improvements. Basically, what we've seen with the CARES Act are a number of business incentives providing economic relief to both small and large businesses. I'll be focusing again today on the Paycheck Protection Program, some updates regarding SBA loans, and more importantly, what companies are really interested in is how to qualify for loan forgiveness. In addition, David Duski will be covering the Main Street Lending Title IV loans and talking about qualification and some aspects of those loans. And then we'll wrap up with the employee retention credit and other payroll related tax benefits. So next slide, please. So as an overview, as you all may know, the SBA Small Business Administration, as part of the CARES Act, had come up with the Paycheck Protection Program loans. The whole idea behind the PPP loans was really to provide incentives for companies and provide economic incentives for companies to essentially keep employees on payroll. This loan in this program specifically was targeting small businesses with less than 500 employees, as well as certain specific industries that were impacted, including hospitality, hotels, and restaurants. When you look at the original language, there was some confusion around qualification. Even small businesses with less than 500 employees, when you take into consideration some of the language around affiliation roles, they did have to look at affiliated service groups, which meant that you have to look at ownership of those small businesses. And to the extent that there were affiliated businesses, then you have to take into account the employee count resulting from the entire group. So for private equity backed businesses, we saw that this had a huge impact because even if as an individual business, you may qualify with the under 500 employee count, when you look at the ownership structure, you would have to take into consideration oftentimes the employee count for the entire group, affiliated group, including other businesses that, let's say, private equity groups owned. This program did go through 2 rounds of funding. Total funding has all been allocated. Right now, the count is $659 billion in total funds, with a loan maximum of $10 million. And because the proceeds from these loans are intended to really cover specific business costs, including payroll and some other qualified business mortgage interest, as well as healthcare, they have come up with rules that are pretty strict in terms of how businesses can qualify in terms of loan forgiveness. And again, the whole intent is to keep employees on payroll, let's say keep them out of the unemployment system, as that department has seen a huge surge, but understanding that businesses are really on the hook financially to continue paying salaries. The whole intent is to keep employees hired during this time. So next slide, please. We've gotten a lot of questions really around, okay, I've gotten an SBA loan. How do I qualify for the forgiveness amount? And over the last few weeks, we've seen quite a bit of guidance come out. Because the legislation was written pretty quickly, there were, of course, a lot of details that were left out and perhaps not thought through initially. But we have received guidance in terms of exactly what types of costs can be forgiven and how the IRS plans to administer this. We have heard from the Treasury Secretary that any loan amount in excess of $2 million will 100% guaranteed be audited. And however, he has left the window open, saying any business receiving a PPP loan may be subject to audit. So there is going to be quite a bit of scrutiny expected in terms of IRS activity regarding these loans and making sure that businesses, 1, do qualify, and 2, are using the proceeds in the manner expected. And there are going to be some internal procedures that we expect companies to have to follow in order to make sure they can support and document how these loan proceeds are being used and what they're being used for. So BDO, we calculated a loan forgiveness calculator tool that we are sharing with clients and helping them track some of these expenses and making sure that their loan proceeds can be forgiven in terms of the ones that are eligible. So if any questions around that, please feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to help. And with that, I'll turn it over to David Duski, who's going to touch on the Title IV loans, and then I'll be back here shortly to discuss the employee retention credit.
Thanks, David. Next slide, please. Now, small and medium-sized businesses should be aware of programs existing under the CARES Act to provide liquidity in lieu of or in addition to the relief under the PPP, as David mentioned. Now, in particular, Title IV authorizes the Treasury to make loans, loan guarantees, and other investments of up to $500 billion to eligible businesses operating in severely distressed sectors of the economy. $46 billion of the 500 is earmarked for passenger air carriers and cargo air carriers, as well as businesses critical to national security. The remaining $454 billion is available to lend to other businesses via various loan programs established by the Treasury and Federal Reserve. One such program is, as David mentioned, is the Main Street Lending Program. Announced in early April, the Treasury will carve out $75 billion of the available $454 billion under Title IV to make an equity investment in a special purpose vehicle, which will enable the flow of credit to small and medium-sized businesses that were in good financial standing prior to COVID-19. Now, the SPV will purchase either 5% or 95 or 85% of loans, and the lender will carry the rest of on their balance sheets. Next slide, please. Now, one of the more common questions regarding Main Street lending is how to determine if a business qualifies. Now, the flow chart on the slide helps highlight some of the important eligibility criteria. Now, if you look at the slide, a business generally must attest that it can meet its financial obligations for the next 90 days and does not plan on filing for bankruptcy. So in other words, a business must be in good financial standing or was in good financial standing before the COVID-19 pandemic, and that it can meet its obligations. It also needs to demonstrate a need for financing, and that need comes from the COVID-19 pandemic. So businesses that could demonstrate an economic loss could theoretically qualify for assistance under Main Street lending. Now, the Fed made a couple of revisions to some of the requirements, and what you're seeing on your screen are the most up-to-date requirements as we understand them. So businesses can have up to 15,000 employees or less than $5 billion in 2019 revenues. It has to be a business with a majority of its employees based in the US and established before March 13th, 2020. Now, here a couple important things to note about this program. Companies who applied for and received funding under the PPP can theoretically apply for the Main Street lending, so as long as the eligibility requirements on this slide are met. Main Street loans are not forgivable. Unlike PPP, they are loans with the expectation that they will be repaid and all have a 4-year term. Now, unlike the PPP, meeting the eligibility requirements does not guarantee that funds will be received. The lender will use their own underwriting criteria to determine whether or not to issue the loan and for what amount. Next slide, please. Now, there's 3 Main Street loan facilities theoretically to choose from. The new loan facility is directed at facilitating new loans, as the name would suggest. The expanded loan facility focuses on expanding existing loans to businesses, and the priority loan facility requires increased risk sharing by lenders for borrowers who are more leveraged. Importantly, all have principal and interest deferred through 12 months. Now, the amortization varies by facility for the remaining 3 years of the loan. For example, there's a balloon payment in year 4 for both the expanded and priority loan facilities. Businesses can repay the loan at any time without penalty. The rate is LIBOR, the 1 or 3 month LIBOR rate, plus 300 basis points. What businesses should be aware of is that these loans will be made public by the Fed. So even if you're a private company, if you take a Main Street loan, both the principal amount and the interest rate will be publicly available by virtue of the Federal Reserve. Now, the minimum loan size is either $500,000 or $10 million, depending on the facility. And the maximum for new loan or priority loans is capped at $25 million, or a loan amount when you add that to the outstanding and undrawn debt of a business does not exceed either 4 times or 6 times 2019 adjusted EBITDA. And for the expanded loan, as you can see on your screen, it's the lesser of 200 million, 35% of outstanding and undrawn bank debt, or the amount that does not exceed the borrower's leverage by 6 times adjusted EBITDA. Fees associated with the loan range from, at least on the borrower's standpoint, range from either 75 to 100 basis points of the principal amount of the loan that serve as an origination fee. Now, businesses should be aware that there are covenants and restrictions during the term of the loan and extending for 12 months after that restrict the use of how funds can be used. For example, you cannot use proceeds to repay existing debt. So this is not an opportunity to refinance existing debt that you may carry on your balance sheet. You cannot make stock repurchases for 12 months if you're on a national stock exchange. You cannot pay dividends or capital distributions. And there are limitations on compensation of highly compensated individuals. Generally speaking, those being compensated in an amount of $425,000 or more in 2019. Now, the application has not been released yet by the Fed for Main Street lending, but we anticipate it doing so in the near future. Interested borrowers should contact their banks to see if they plan on participating in the program. Also, common questions we get is, can private equity qualify? Generally, yes. Unlike PPP with a lot of restrictions on affiliation, private equity can apply so long as they meet the eligibility requirements and don't violate certain affiliation rules. Others ask about nonprofit. Nonprofits are not eligible under Main Street. However, the good news is the Federal Reserve is developing another program for those entities to seek relief that meet their unique needs. And with that, I will turn it back over to David.
Great, thank you. So as part of the CARES Act, there were a number of payroll-related benefits. One of the most lucrative that we're finding is really related to the employee retention credit. And the whole idea behind this credit is an incentive, again, for businesses to retain employees. And this credit is a maximum credit of $5,000, which is calculated to be 50% of qualified wages paid to employees during a certain period. And in order for businesses to qualify for this credit, one of 2 requirements must be met. The first one being that their operations must be either fully or partially suspended due to a COVID-19 related government shutdown order. This could be federal, state, local, city related orders, so they're not limited to any specific jurisdiction, but it would be including any kind of government shutdown order that would limit the ability for businesses or their employees to travel or conduct commerce or, let's say, hold group meetings or conferences. So if your operations were fully or partially suspended due to any kind of government orders, this credit would be eligible for you. And then if not, let's say for essential businesses, where no government order really suspended their ability to operate, but their gross receipts in any 2020 quarter were less than 50% of the same quarter prior year comparable, then they would also qualify. And so for this credit, we're seeing some differences in how the credit would benefit in terms of employers of smaller size to larger size. Smaller size being employers with less than 100 employees. If you're an employer with less than 100 employees calculated at the control group level, and your business was impacted due to government shutdown orders, then essentially you would be eligible to take a $5,000 credit up to $10,000 in paid wages to every employee at the company. For employers with more than 100, you would have to evaluate it, one, at the employer level to make sure that the business would qualify and meets these requirements. And then the second level of qualification would be individually at the employee level. So documenting which employees were essentially continuing to receive compensation or health care with either working reduced hours or performing less services. So that's how the employee retention credit works generally. And a couple things to point out, one being any business who receives a PPP loan would not be eligible for this credit. They are mutually exclusive, and the IRS has come out with guidance understanding some of the confusion around the PPP loan qualification, that if you did receive a PPP loan and you returned the proceeds that you received by a certain date, then that would allow you to take this credit. Next slide, please. We've gotten a lot of questions around this employee retention credit, and there has been a couple rounds of guidance come out from the IRS on their website, as well as the Joint Committee of Taxation. Some of the common questions include what kind of backup data is needed to claim this. I would say documentation that would be expected would include support around how the business was impacted and how the employer meets the qualification test, as well as each individual employee that is being included, how either their service time was impacted due to government orders to shut down or stay at home, or any kind of data supporting the fact that they were receiving full compensation or partial compensation, but working less hours. Another common question is, if we furlough employees but continue to pay their healthcare costs, can the healthcare costs be included as well? And the answer is yes. There has been some back and forth on this. The IRS essentially came out with their first round of FAQs saying no, healthcare costs paid to furloughed employees or employees not receiving compensation will not be includable. That did contradict what we saw from the JCT. And since then, the IRS has come back in the last week or so, updating their guidance to say if you're paying employee healthcare costs, but let's say not paying hourly employee wages during the furlough period, the employer part of the healthcare costs can go toward this credit. So something that could be pretty substantial for certain businesses that are covering healthcare costs for many of their employees. Another common question, how should we document the number of hours paid but not worked for salaried employees? The language that we're seeing in this credit really resemble the whole concept of supporting and allocating, let's say, certain activities and therefore certain wages. And so there are a number of different methodologies and approaches, including surveying, speaking with direct supervisors, or looking at it from an individual employee level. Depending on the business and the structure, there are different ways to figure out how to do this efficiently and effectively. But it seems like the survey approach right now is probably the most beneficial and the easiest one for companies to implement. And the last question, if we're an essential business, there was no government order mandating that we suspend commerce or shut down, can we still qualify? And the answer would be yes. If one, you meet the gross receipts test, meaning in any quarter in 2020, your gross receipts were 50% or less of the same quarter in 2019, you would qualify. Additionally, we're seeing essential businesses such as, let's say, restaurants. If government orders suspended in restaurant dining, but allowed, let's say, delivery or takeout, then you would still qualify because the in dining experience was limited and suspended due to government orders. Additionally, for healthcare, with elective surgeries being suspended, healthcare is still an essential business, but if there were portions of your business that were ordered to shut down, this would still be eligible credit also. So with that, we wrap up the employee retention credit, and I believe next up is Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks to all of our panelists. So one of the questions that's came in, and Eskander, I don't know if this is directed towards you or not, but as companies more work from home, Are companies doing disbursements on expensing additional, you know what, if you need to buy a chair, need to buy new technology? Are companies starting to allow, I know we used to have bring your own device. Are you seeing any indications that employers are being IT spending go up because people are working from home?
I am. I think Aftab actually mentioned the quote from Microsoft Satya about the amount of digital transformation that's occurred in the past few months is about 2 years worth. We see that across the board. Just personal experience with our firm. Immediately when the work from home quarantine hit, we sent out notes to our employee base, making sure that they were enabled to work remotely. A lot of companies are doing that very basic task right now, is making sure that the work from home productivity is high. I would say I'd play that forward into the manufacturing setting and say the ability to drive a facility completely or almost remotely is becoming more and more prevalent with some of the technology around the Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, and being able to set up digital twins for environments. So we're definitely seeing the fact that all of us are stuck and sheltered in place, enabling some of that.
And I think that not only goes along to technology, but for, you know, I'm squirming in my chair here because it has to be one of the most uncomfortable chairs around. And I'm really thinking about my work chair, and I wish I had that at home. So I think it's not just technology, but making sure people have a nice workplace at home. One of the issues that a lot of our members and a lot in the technology community are having are keeping their kids occupied, right? So school's getting ready to get out for the summer. They've been out anyway, but you know, there's no day camps, there's no summer camps. And so it seems like we're going to have to find a solution to how to occupy our kids' time if we're going to expect parents to work.
Yeah, and Kevin,
I go back to good old. Go ahead, Aftab.
I was going to say that, you know, on the question, I certainly have heard companies reimbursing for the technology tools. I have not so far seen a generalized reimbursements of furniture other than for medical reasons. But many companies now thinking of making work from home, you know, more permanent than the forced lockdown. I do expect that, you know, we'll see some change in the policies and behavior. But so far, in my experience, has been to the tools, not furnitures per se.
Very good. I think we've answered most of the questions. There's been one came in that says, there's been reports in the media that all PP loans under 2 million will be forgiven. Do you feel this is true? What is your advice? Cautions.
So we've
David, you want
learned
to take that?
Sure. So PPP loans in excess of 2 million will all be audited. No confirmation that PPP loans under 2 million will all be forgiven. Again, the forgivable amounts under PPP program are very strict and do require support and documentation. They are limited to certain expenses and payroll related expenses as well as some others. So you do have to still provide all the support. You do have to show that you meet the requirements in terms of employing and retaining employee counts as well. And so that, I guess that rumor, we certainly have not confirmed it. We've actually heard the opposite, that the guidelines around loan forgiveness have been pretty constraining and really focused on documentation to support that the funds are being used correctly.
Good. So we're going to bring this to a conclusion here. We will send out a deck of this presentation. There's been a request. It's always going to be on YouTube, but we had a couple of requests to directly send out the things. So first of all, you know, we see a lot, those of us who follow news every day, it's really difficult for us to get perspective. And I think one of the things that this presentation did is it gave us that much needed perspective. So I want to thank BDO. Lee Duran here in San Diego, a partner in San Diego, is on our board of directors. He certainly gives us advice and guidance, but it looks like BDO really pulled in the A-team to really help put this in perspective. So I know you all have very busy schedules, so I want to thank each and every one of you for spending time with Tech San Diego this morning, and we look forward to possibly having you on in the future. You could always go to techsd.org to find out more about Tech San Diego and what we have. I'm going to ask our events manager, Sara Spiva, if there's anything we've missed before we go off. Sara, anything?
No, I believe that's all. Thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to visit the Tech San Diego resource page, accessible from the front page of our website at techsandiego.org for this presentation and other presentations provided by our partners, BDO and others.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.